Today we're wrapping up our identity series that we've been in, all about discovering identity in Christ, who you say I am. And so if you remember, we started off by asking the question, who do you think you are? And how our thoughts, our minds, our beliefs play into shaping our identity, and that at the end of the day, it's God who decides what our identity is. It's not our experience. We are who God says that we are. And then we explored how we're citizens of heaven. Rachel looked at how we are created in God's image. And then last week, I looked at how we are children of God, that we've been adopted into the family of heaven. So if these are just like really foundational messages, understanding our identity in Christ is so key. So if you missed any of them, I'd encourage you just to go back, jump on our YouTube channel, go to everydayslo.com and catch up with those messages. But today, we're going to wrap up by looking at the statement that I am more than a conqueror. I am more than a conqueror. I wonder how many of you would identify with this conundrum. What do you say when someone says to you, how you doing? What's your response when someone asks you, how you doing? It's a question we get asked all the time, right? Sometimes, there are all sorts of different ways that we could ask it. Someone might ask you, how you doing? Just as a way of saying hello, that's all it means. They're not really asking how you're doing. Sometimes people might ask you it in a kind of a serious kind of way, kind of a, how are you doing? Or alternatively, there's always the Joey Tribbiani way of asking how you doing. How you doing? But how do you respond when someone asks you, how are you doing? Like it feels like often maybe we get asked, it's somewhere between a, how you doing, hello, and a serious, how are you doing? It's kind of in that mid kind of range, and you're like, it seems superficial and sometimes untruthful just to say great. Yeah. You can always resort to the classic non-committal, I'm fine, which doesn't really say anything, does it? It's not one way or the other. But most of the time, that other person is probably not looking for you to pour out your heart in the middle of the grocery store when they say, hey, how you doing? How do we respond in a real yet appropriate way? I don't have any answers today, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. But let's face it, life can be tough, right? We know that. We all know that. Life can be tough. Everybody in this room has got struggles going on in their life right now. Every single person. I love what Rick Warren says about this. He says, I used to think that life was a series of hills and valleys, mountaintops where everything was great and valleys where everything was bad. And he said, as I got older, I became to realize that life is much more like a set of railroad tracks. Pretty much always, there's something good going on in your life, and pretty much always, there's something not so good going on in your life. Sometimes it's more good than bad, sometimes it's more bad than good, but there's always blessing, and there's always battle going on like railroad tracks in our lives. There's so many blessings, but also so many battles for each of us, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. If you were here last week, you might remember that at the end of the chapter that we read, at the end of the section of scripture that we read, in Romans 8:17, if you've got a Bible, maybe turn there with me now to Romans 8. It tells us that in Romans 8:17, that one day we're going to get to share in Christ's glory. That's a pretty incredible blessing right there, isn't it? But we only get to share in his glory one day if we also share in his sufferings here and now. So we shouldn't be surprised when life isn't so great. We shouldn't be surprised when we have struggles, when we have issues with our relationships, when we have issues with our finances or our health or whatever else is going on. Yes, God is good, but we live in a fallen world and we're going to experience suffering. But at the end of the day, suffering is the way that ultimately we get to share in his glory because we share in his sufferings. Paul goes on, if we keep reading in Romans 8 and then picking up in verse 18, he says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subject to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole of creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. So we don't experience the glory that God has for us. We experience instead right now a part of that glory, but also we experience a whole bunch of suffering along with that. We all have suffering in our lives. We have physical suffering. We have mental suffering. We have emotional suffering. We have a relational suffering. We have financial suffering, right? We're all experiencing, I'm sure, at least one of those areas of suffering in our life right now. We live in a nation that has huge issues with violence, with drug use, with depression, anxiety, and suicide. In this nation, we're divided right down the middle on pretty much every important issue that there is. People are struggling to find their identity like never before. We look further afield. We live in a world that's torn apart by war. Not just high-profile areas like the war in Europe with Ukraine and Russia, but if you count as war, armed conflicts that have resulted in the death of at least 1,000 people in the last year. There are 20 wars going on around the world right now. 20 wars that have resulted in the death of at least 1,000 people in the last 12 months. Famine, HIV, AIDS, corruption, those are all issues that dramatically affect the developing world particularly. And as Paul says, in Romans 8 right here, creation itself is suffering. Just this week, scientists predicted that the world would pass the threshold of a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature for the first time by 2027. So that's comparing the global temperature of the world now compared with what it was before the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And that increase by 2027, it might only be a temporary increase. It might drop back down again. But scientists say that a consistent increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius over the course of a decade will drastically change the world. And it's likely that increase is likely to happen in the next few years. Creation is suffering. Just like Paul said, it's crying out for the children of God to be revealed, for Christ to return, and for all things to be made new. So how do we respond to all those challenges? I'm not trying to be a downer. I'm just reminding you of everything that's wrong in your life and everything that's wrong with the world and everything that's wrong with the planet. But these are realities, right? This is what we face every single day. How do we respond to those challenges? Well, based on our personality type, we probably respond somewhere along the spectrum between two extremes. Extreme number one is that we get overwhelmed and we stop functioning. We just kind of give up on life and we're just like, I just can't handle that. Or we just sweep it all under the carpet and we think of rainbows and unicorns instead and just pretend like it's not happening. Those are kind of the two kind of extremes that we probably all fall somewhere between those two extremes is our typical way of responding to the suffering and the challenges in life. But here in Romans chapter 8, after he's expanded upon these sufferings and talked about the suffering of creation, Paul has a different response. Take a look with me at Romans chapter 8 and verse 31 through 39. He says, "What then shall we say in response to these things? Given all this suffering that's taking place, given the mess that creation's in, what shall we say in response? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who then is the one who condemns? No one." In case you weren't sure what the answer was, it's no one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God, and he is also interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. That's Paul's response to the suffering that we face. Let me go through each of those really quickly, one by one, before I get really to the heart of what I want to talk about today. Firstly, Paul says in response, if God is for us, who can be against us? God is on your side. He's with you. He's going to bat for you. He's cheering you on. And if God is for you, who is ever going to stand a chance of prevailing against you? Whatever is going on, he is with you. Nobody else stands a chance of coming against you. That's number one. Number two, Paul says, if God gave us his son, how will he not give us everything else that we need? Seriously, if you think about it, if God was prepared to give up for you the most precious thing he had, his own son, why would he hold back anything else? Doesn't make any sense, does it? If you're experiencing lack in any area of your life right now, ask him. Personally, we've seen God come through so many times financially when we prayed to him. Sometimes that looks like a check in the mail that you weren't expecting. But hey, sometimes it looks like an opportunity to make some money through doing some work that you weren't expecting. Sometimes it's not just, hey, here it is on a platter. Sometimes it involves you putting some effort in yourself. But it's still all God's provision. But it's not just about money either, is it? James says, if you lack wisdom, ask God. He wants to provide you with everything that you need. Ask him for whatever it is that you need in the midst of your struggles, because he loves to provide. The third thing Paul says, he says, if God justifies, who will condemn? I've, over the last few months, been getting back into Law and Order. Anyone, any Law and Order fans? Love Law and Order? It's just so good. And just, the whole legal thing, they go and they arrest the guy and they get into the courtroom and the judge is there and the defense lawyer and the prosecution lawyer and all of that kind of stuff. But justify right here is a legal term. It means to render just or innocent. Picture a courtroom in Law and Order, with God as the judge. And before the case is even brought, he's already decided what his ruling is going to be. He's already decided that you, sitting there at the defense table as the defendant, that you're already innocent. He's already justified you. He's already made you just and innocent. So in which case then, who would dare stand up for the prosecution if God the judge has already made his decision? Who's going to bother to do that? But Paul goes on that even if there was a prosecutor, even if Satan dared to stand up and show his face and to bring charges against you, verse 34 tells us who is seated at the table for the defense? Jesus, ready to intercede with our Father, the judge, on our behalf. You've got the Father as your judge and you've got Jesus as your defense lawyer. I think you're in pretty good company right there. The fourth thing that Paul says in response, he says, if God loves us, what could possibly separate us from that love? He says, no trouble that you're experiencing right now can separate you from his love. No hardship, no persecution, no famine, no nakedness, no need that you have, no danger or sword can separate you from God's love. No challenge that you face, no suffering that you experience will ever separate you from God's love. The suffering and the struggles that you are facing does not mean that God does not love you. It doesn't. Our sufferings are not an indicator of God's blessing or God's curse or God's love for you or not love for you. In fact, actually, he's a good father who disciplines the ones that he loves. Sometimes our suffering is a result of discipline from God. Not always, but sometimes it is. He loves us so much. He loves us so dearly. And then Paul brings all of these things together. He brings together this idea that if God is for us, who can be against us? If God gave us his son, how will he not give us everything else we need? He brings together, if God justifies, who will condemn? And if God loves us, what can separate us from that love? And he says, no, nothing, none of these things. Because in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Now, I'm pretty sure we know what a conqueror is. But what does it mean to be more than a conqueror? How can you be more than a conqueror? Back in England and when I first got here to America, I spent a lot of time playing softball. And in softball, there's something called a mercy rule. And the mercy rule comes into play when one team is whooping another. The mercy rule is, it depends on the competition, but a typical mercy rule would be that if one team is 15 runs or more ahead by the end of the third inning, or 10 runs ahead after the fifth inning, the game's over. That's it. The umpire's just like, no, I'm not going to let you pound the other team into the ground anymore. We're just going to call the game. There's no way they're coming back from it. This whole thing is over. In a normal game of softball, maybe you might win by 5 runs. That would make you a conqueror. But if you win by 15 runs after the third inning and the other team wasn't even in the game, that makes you more than a conqueror. Right? When two teams take the field, they line up at the beginning the field, the court, whatever it is they're playing on, when they line up at the beginning, there's a chance that either of the two teams might be the conqueror. Either of the two teams might be victorious. But being more than a conqueror is like the LA Lakers stepping onto the same court as the SLO high varsity basketball team. You know that there is absolutely no chance that one of those teams is going to win that game. The game's over before it's even been played. That's what it means to be more than a conqueror. The enemy has absolutely no chance. You have already won through Jesus Christ. That's why you're more than a conqueror. The Greek word here for more than a conqueror, actually it means super conqueror. Super conqueror. You know, with the fascination that we have in our society with superhero movies, you know, it's an easy picture to conjure, isn't it? It's like, it reminds me of those criminals who are robbing a store and like Superman shows up. And they've got a gun and a ski mask and that's it. And there's Superman right there. I mean, you know, it's not even a story, is it? It's not even a competition. It's not even a fight. That's what it means to be a super conqueror. That's what it means to be more than a conqueror. Now that's all amazing. And I hope that you guys are all super encouraged by that you're super conquerors, that you're more than a conqueror. But let me ask you a question. Are you really living like a super conqueror today? As you look at the world, as you look at your life, do you even feel like a conqueror, let alone a super conqueror? Are you conquering your struggles? Are you conquering your demons? Are you conquering your addictions? Are you conquering your finances? Because the thing is, while yes, ultimately we are more than conquerors through Christ Jesus, that's our identity, that's who we are, that's the end of the story, we know that, skip ahead, we win. It actually takes something from us to experience the reality of being more than a conqueror in our everyday life today. Because being more than a conqueror means that we're powerful people. We have the same power that raised Jesus Christ from the dead, that's the Holy Spirit, living inside of us. That's power right there. But instead of living like powerful people, instead of living like victors, we often live our lives living like victims instead, which is the exact opposite of being powerful. We live today in a blame culture, right? Someone else always has to be to blame for what's going wrong. It can't ever be our fault for what's going on. It's our parents' fault, it's our spouse's fault, it's our boss's fault, it's our pastor's fault, it's the kid's fault, you know, it's God's fault, whoever it is. I read a story a long time ago about a man who decided to try a stunt involving swallowing razor blades. I'm not sure why you would want to do that. But surprise, surprise, he ended up at the hospital in the emergency room and got a huge bill for the care that he received. And of course, you know, this guy took full responsibility for his actions, didn't he? No, he didn't. He ended up suing the hospital for subjecting him to harmful radiation during x-rays after swallowing razor blades. This is a true story. We might not try and cast blame in quite such an extreme way, but you know, it's the alarm clock's fault, or nowadays your phone's fault that you're late for work or it didn't go off. Nothing to do with the fact that you didn't set it, maybe. You know, it's the church's fault that you're not growing spiritually. It's the kids' fault that you don't have time to spend with God. And pretty much everything else is the government's fault, right? But the key to being a powerful person, the key to accessing the power to live as more than a conqueror, is to do the exact opposite of that. It's to take responsibility. Jim Rohn is really America's kind of foremost business philosopher. And he says this. He says, you must take personal responsibility. You cannot change the circumstances, the seasons, or the wind, but you can change yourself. It's the only thing you can change is yourself. And we have to take 100% responsibility for what happens in our lives because God gave us free will. That free will is the choice to choose, and with the choice to choose comes a responsibility for our lives. We've talked about this before, but God is not in control. He gave up control when he gave you free will. He's in charge, absolutely. But he's not in control. The only person who is in control of your life is you. No one else. Your parents can't control you. Your boss can't control you. Your parents can't control you. The only person who is really actually in control of your life is you, which is why you have to take 100% responsibility for it. And taking responsibility starts with letting go of blame. Because our first instinct as human beings is not to take responsibility, but to blame someone else. It goes right back to the garden. It goes right back to Adam and Eve. When God confronts Adam for eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what does Adam do? Does he take responsibility for what he did? No, he blames his wife. And what does Eve do? Does she take responsibility? No, she blames the serpent. Right back at the beginning. It's blame. Moses is another example. Twice while the Israelites were in the wilderness, Moses brings forth water from a rock for the complaining Israelites. The first time God says to him, hey, take your staff, strike this rock, and water will come forth. And so he does it, he hits the rock, water comes out. And the people's thirst is satisfied for a moment. The second time it happens, God changes his instruction. He says to Moses, speak to the rock. But because Moses was frustrated and angry at the complaining people, what did he do? He struck the rock again with his staff. And he still got water to come out of it. But God was displeased. And he said to Moses, because you disobeyed me in that, now you don't get to go into the promised land. Because you didn't speak to the rock, like I said, because you struck it, because you were angry, now you don't get to enter the promised land. And Moses was pretty angry and upset about that, understandably. And so as often we do, he looked for somewhere to place the blame. Where could he put the blame? Maybe he could put the blame on the staff. You know, maybe he could put the blame on the rock. Maybe he could blame the Lord. Eventually his eyes settled on the people. And he said, the Lord was angry with me because of you. He blamed them for the fact that he didn't get into the promised land rather than taking responsibility that it was he who disobeyed God and he who struck the rock instead of speaking to the rock. Right at the end of his life, he was still holding on to that blame and refusing to take responsibility for his own actions. And this was Moses, the greatest leader of God's people in the Old Testament, and he still had to struggle with blame. But the problem with blame is that blame prevents us from moving forward. If we blame others for our circumstances, we absolve ourselves of responsibility. And by doing that, by not taking responsibility, we make ourselves weak and powerless. Because if something else is someone else's fault, well, what can we do about it? Nothing. It's down to them. we're making ourselves weak. We're making ourselves victims. But if we take responsibility for what happens to us, we empower ourselves. We make ourselves powerful people because it means we can do something about the things that we don't like in our lives. Listen, Jesus did not endure the cross so that you and I could play at victim. He endured the cross so that you could be powerful, so that you could be more than a conqueror, not so that we could play the blame game and become victims. Now, you might say, well, I don't have complete control over everything that happens to me. And that's partially true. But while we may not be able to control what happens to us all of the time, we do have a say in how what happens to us affects our lives. And there's a little formula that I want to show you guys that helps us to do that. If we can throw that slide up, Sophie. E plus R equals O. Event plus response equals outcome. Every outcome you experience in your life is a result of how you have responded to an event or a series of events in your life. Does that make sense? If you don't like the outcomes that you're getting in life, you have two options. Option one is that you can blame the events for the lack of results in your life. You can blame the events for the things that you don't like. That's what blame is, right? We try and pass off blame anywhere we can find to hang it. We blame all sorts of limiting factors that get in our way. We blame anything that comes against us. I don't have enough money, or I don't have the right job, or I don't have this, that, and I don't have this, that, and the other to get the life that I want to have. But you know what? History is filled with people who overcome extreme limiting odds to achieve great success. A great example is Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey might be a billionaire now, but she came from an extremely poor upbringing. As a child, she moved back and forth from her father to her mother who lived in different states. At the age of 9, she was raped by her 19-year-old cousin. She was later sexually abused by other members of her family, including her uncle and her mother's boyfriend. Finally, fed up, she ran away from home at the age of 14. And that same year, she became pregnant and gave birth to a sick son who died soon after he was born. Then she went to live with her father, and her father helped straighten out her life. But you see, it's not the so-called limiting factors that stop us. Because Oprah Winfrey is a great example of how it's possible to overcome any of those limiting factors. Actually, it's ourselves that stop us. It's our limiting thoughts and our self-destructive behaviors that we engage in that limit us, not the circumstances and the situations that we face. You know, if we spend more money than we make, it's not the fault of your employer for not paying you enough. It's your responsibility to spend less and to make a budget. You know, this year I've been trying to lose weight, and I've made the choice to count calories and not to eat certain things. I've made the choice to go to the gym. If I wanted to lose weight, but I ate lunch at McDonald's every day, it would not be Ray Kroc's fault for putting a McDonald's on every street corner. The Ray Kroc movie, The Founder, about McDonald's is a great movie. If you haven't checked it out, I'd recommend it. But it's not his fault. It's my responsibility to make better choices. Those are kind of stupid examples, but if we don't like what we're experiencing, the only way it's going to change is if we stop blaming someone else or stop blaming the situations and the circumstances and change our response. That's the second option. We can blame the circumstances, in which case nothing will change. Or secondly, we can change our response until we get the outcome that we want. You are in control of your responses, and your responses are what makes all the difference. We can't control everything that happens to us in the world, but we can control how we respond to those things with God's help. In 1994, the Northridge earthquake struck LA, and it damaged one of the main freeways into the city, and traffic was at a standstill. And CNN was doing reporting from the scene, and they were going from car to car as the traffic was at a standstill and interviewing people. And the reporter knocked on the window of one of the cars and asked the driver how he was doing. "How you doing?" There you go. Oh, wow. That's quiet now. The driver of the car said, "I hate California. First there were fires, then floods, now an earthquake. No matter what time I leave in the morning, I'm going to be late for work. I can't believe it." That was his response. The reporter went to the car behind him, knocked on the window, and asked the driver in that car the same question. The driver was all smiles. The driver said, "It's no problem. I left my house at 5 a.m. I don't think under the circumstances my boss can ask for any more of that. I have lots of music cassettes," shows you it was 1994, "and my Spanish language tapes with me. I've got my cell phone. I have coffee in a thermos. I've got my lunch. I even bought a book to read, so I'm fine." Now, if the earthquake or the traffic were really the deciding variables in that situation, then everyone should have been angry, right? But everyone wasn't angry. It was their individual response to the situation, to the circumstances, that decided their outcome, that decided whether they were mad, whether they were frustrated, or whether they were at peace. And actually, they were having a good day. It was thinking in a positive or a negative way. It was leaving the house prepared or unprepared that made the difference. And that is exactly the kind of thing that we have control over. Which one of those two people was the conqueror that day? It wasn't the guy in the first car, was it? Living as more than conquerors means living as powerful people. It means living as people who take 100% responsibility for their lives and refuse to live as victims, tossed back and forth in the sea of everyone else's drama. If you don't like what's going on with you, you don't like what's happening to you, do something about it. Change your response to that situation. Get a fresh perspective on it. Bring it to God and see what He has to say about it. Because, ultimately, you are not a super conqueror through willpower alone. Willpower will get you a little way, but it won't get you all the way. It's the power of the Holy Spirit that makes us powerful people. It's the love of Christ that enables us to stand strong when the world throws all that it's got at us.